Dream machine. DICOM, HL7, I18 in the snap. We're building the future, never looking back.
Welcome to Imaging Informatics Unplugged, and today I am joined by Brian Casey, managing editor of the Imaging Wire and one of the most recognizable voices in medical imaging journalism. Brian has been covering radiology since 1992, starting with Diagnostic Imaging magazine and then going on to become one of the founding editor-in-chiefs of AntMini.com in 1999, where he led content operations for more than 2 decades. Today, he continues that work at the Imaging Wire, where he covers the intersection of radiology, healthcare, and emerging technology. And honestly, if you've been around medical imaging for any length of time, there's a pretty good chance Brian has reported on at least one major industry shift before the rest of us fully understood what was happening. In this conversation, we look back at the early days of digital imaging when film was still everywhere, PACS was just emerging, DICOM was becoming one of the most important standards in imaging. Brian talks about his first RSNA in 1992, when DICOM was one of the big stories, and how that standard helped break apart the old proprietary model where scanners, PACS, viewing software were often locked into a single vendor ecosystem. As Brian points out, that shift laid the groundwork for digital radiology, teleradiology, and eventually AI that we see today. We also get into some of the trends that surprised him over the years. PET took longer to mature than some expected. Alternative mammography technologies never really displaced traditional screening, and point-of-care ultrasound went from something that looked like a novelty to something that has become a major force in clinical care. And that part of the discussion might especially be relevant for anyone thinking about enterprise imaging, because once imaging moves outside of the traditional radiology spaces, the informatics questions start multiplying fast. Where does the data go? Who owns the workflow? How do we preserve context? And how do we make sure that images remain useful beyond the moment that they were acquired? From there, we talk about consolidation across the imaging industry, including the disappearance of many mid-sized imaging companies, the role of large multinational vendors, and what that pattern might mean for AI companies today. Brian draws a clear line between earlier waves of consolidation in modalities and PACS and what is happening now with AI, where hospitals may have limited appetite for managing 20 narrow vendors across one clinical workflow. We also spend time on the changing nature of journalism and communication in radiology. Brian reflects on the shift from traditional trade publications to websites, newsletters, social media, video, podcasts, and direct-to-audience channels. And this part of the conversation hits close to home because imaging informatics is no longer just about the systems in the background. It's about how ideas move, how companies tell their stories, how leaders build trust, and how the industry separates useful signal from a lot of very polished noise. And finally, we look ahead to SIIM, including why Brian sees it as such a valuable and focused meeting, especially compared with larger shows like the RSNA. We touch on AI reporting, AI-assisted report generation, foundation models, and why SIIM creates a different kind of environment for meaningful conversations across imaging informatics, radiology vendors, and healthcare technology. Now, before we jump in, I also just want to highlight the new Nagels Consulting website, nagelsconsulting.com. Check it out. We've been building out a growing set of imaging informatics education, including courses that are designed for PACS admins, imaging informatics professionals, project managers, clinical stakeholders, and the list goes on and on. Anyone that's trying to understand how medical imaging systems actually work in the real world. That includes our CIIP Foundations course, our imaging informatics training, and new resources focused on the workflows, standards, and operations and professional practice areas that matter to enterprise imaging. So after you listen to the episode, head over to nagelsconsulting.com, check out the latest courses and resources. And if you're trying to build real imaging informatics fluency and not just memorize acronyms or survive another vendor's demo, this is exactly what we're building. With all that said, let's jump into the conversation with Brian Casey. Well, hello, Brian. Thank you very much for joining Imaging Informatics Unplugged. It's nice to get to meet you officially, and it's also nice to have the microphone pointed towards you this time. So
Yeah, the tables are turned, aren't they?
I'm very excited about this conversation because you have been in and around imaging for many, many years, and you hold a very unique perspective because you have been reporting a lot of the development of imaging since the 90s. And I'm interested to hear your perspective when you look back at the early days when you were starting out to where we are now, significant change across the industry over the past number of years.
Awesome. Well, I think I'm probably going to end up dating myself by saying that my first RSNA was in 1992. And that at the time I was working for Diagnostic Imaging magazine, which a lot of old timers are probably going to remember. And it's still around as a website, but back then it was, this is pre-internet, so it was a magazine. And when I went to my first RSNA, I think the big story then was this thing called DICOM, and they were talking about, this DICOM standard that they were going to implement that was going to, standardize digital images and make it possible for somebody to buy a PACS and be able to use pieces from different vendors, because at the time PACS was kind of like, it was a single vendor solution. So let's say you bought your CT scanner from vendor A and you had to use, if they had it, you had to use the PACS from vendor A. Mm-hmm. And DICOM, because of the proprietary file format, and so vendor A's file format was different from vendor B and vendor C and all this kind of stuff. So DICOM changed all that, and it meant that you could acquire a scan with vendor A's CT scanner and look at it on software from vendor B or C or whatever you wanted to do. So that was kind of I didn't totally realize at the time like how significant that was going to be, but it really laid the groundwork for digitizing radiology, and that opened the door to so many different things that have really fundamentally changed how radiology is practiced. Teleradiology, radiologists working from home, sending scans to other places. And more importantly, and we didn't know this at the time, but more importantly, it laid the groundwork for AI, because if these images weren't digital, you'd never be able to use AI to analyze them. And AI is going to have an impact on radiology that is potentially even bigger than, how PACS and digitization had on the field.
Absolutely. Well, we're definitely going to get to some conversations around AI. I want to stay in the time machine. So we're in the early 90s. You said first RSNA is 92. And as you're reporting, there still is this large swath of film-based environments that are out there. The mid-'80s is when ACR and NEMA are having these conversations. ICOM is finally here. We still haven't got to the point of IHE yet. And so were you reporting on just imaging as a whole and even the analog stuff, or was it very focused on the digital potential?
Yeah, we were writing about everything. So a fair bit of stuff was analog. You still had chest X-ray or just X-ray in general that was analog, ultrasound. So a fair bit of what radiology was doing was still analog. And then you had this company called DuPont come along with a digital X-ray detector, digital radiography, and we also had computed radiography, of course, but that wasn't quite as sophisticated. And so that started to take the biggest analog modality digital. And I think once we did that, that made it possible to just have the entire radiology department be digital.
You mentioned DuPont. I love these stories where you have these companies that we don't think of in terms of traditional imaging companies anymore. I always think the story of Lockheed Martin, building a PACS that ended up becoming the GE PACS.
Yeah, I mean, for a little while, people thought that PACS was going to be controlled by defense contractors, because we had a number. I think that some of the big PACS installations were at like military facilities, things like DINPACS and stuff like that. The defense contractors kind of thought, oh, well, this is military stuff, so we should be able to get in there and do it. And obviously that didn't come to pass. But that was kind of a brief little path we went down for a little while.
I always find when you go to RSNA or SIIM, there are waves of trends that you will encounter depending on the year. If this was around the 2012 time period, everyone's going to be talking about dose. A little bit after that, everyone's talking about cloud. And we see these phases of disruption and change that are coming, and new opportunities. Some of them, some of these don't pan out as we expected. When you look at where you started, where you have this film-based and digital workflows that are occurring, and all the way to where we are today, what have been some of the trends that you think were most misunderstood?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been a lot of trends that people didn't think were going to be something, and they just took a lot longer to develop. I think PET's a good example. I remember when I started, people were like, well, PET, it's great. It gives you a lot of information, but it's just so expensive and we can't afford it. And ultimately, the clinical value of PET was so great that you couldn't ignore it. So we're talking about what hasn't quite panned out. I mean, it seems like a lot of alternative mammography technologies haven't really gone anywhere. Like people have come out and said, oh, we can do thermography or something like that. And we can do a different way to do mammography that doesn't involve radiation. I don't really know that anything has really panned out. I mean, mammography is really still, the lion's share of the breast cancer screening, and it's gotten better, with new technologies like contrast enhanced mammography and with AI and analysis of mammography. It really holds the majority of what we do for breast cancer screening. One technology that kind of surprised me a little bit was point of care ultrasound. I remember when some of the first scanners came out, the little handheld scanners, and I was just like, well, this is just a little toy. What is anybody going to do with something like this when you've got a cart-based system that is so powerful? And I was wrong on that one. I mean, POCUS is huge now, and POCUS is an example of a broader trend in radiology toward sort of miniaturization and digitization that really puts, really powerful tools in the hands of clinicians at the point of care. And so that's been, a really good example.
I always like when I hear the analogy, POCUS being the 21st century stethoscope.
Yeah.
And it's just, the onslaught of POCUS imaging that we're seeing now that introduces new challenges. And how do we manage this? Where do we store it? How do we identify that the contextual information is accurate? And when it comes to some of these new trends, areas, focuses, what is your approach on getting up to speed as best you can? Because here you are reporting on some of these endeavors, and I'd love to hear the process that you go into to make sure that you understand things appropriately, and like who are the players in this field and so on.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you could even expand it to, how do you know that something that's developing out there in the world is going to, become a big story? I remember at the end of 2019, we started hearing about these infections that were happening in China. They were using CT pretty early on to try to figure out what was going on with people out there. At first it was kind of like, something happened in Wuhan, with this out in the middle of nowhere in China. I don't know anything about this, and developed into COVID. And that really changed the world and changed our specialties. It's more of an art than a science, I think. I think you always need to look at any new technology as being something that's potentially game-changing until, somehow you find out it's not. And I always, as a journalist, I always try to at least mention new things coming up, because you never know where it's going to go. This point of care ultrasound stuff, where's that going to go? This PET thing, what's going to happen with that? DICOM, what's going to go on there? So I think you've got to look at everything with a little bit of respect for the technology and where it's going to develop, because a lot of things, happening out there in the field, and nobody's doing press releases about it. And then all of a sudden you find out, holy cow, everybody's using these POCUS scanners. So I think that you need to kind of have a healthy respect for the technology, and until something is proven otherwise.
And so through the years, you've seen imaging companies rise, merge, all get rebranded as different companies. My mind immediately goes to back in the fall, we saw GE or the acquisition of Intelerad. Years back, Philips and Carestream. Your thoughts as to where you see this, the trend of amalgamation happening, as we see a lot of, smaller AI companies that are very niche in what they serve. Where do they fit into the broader landscape? Do you think it's inevitable that we're going to see them amalgamating into larger organizations.
I think we're seeing that. I think that we're definitely seeing consolidation in AI, with Deep Health rolling up a lot of companies and other smaller ones combining. If you really take an even farther look back to, what we talked about in the 90s, back when I got started in radiology, there were tons of these mid-cap, publicly traded mid-cap imaging companies like Acusign, ATL, ADAC. There were OEMs like Picker and Elsin that were around. And those guys all got consolidated by the big multinational companies, GE, Philips, Siemens, to a lesser extent, Canon, acquired these companies and all those names disappeared. And so now, like, if you ask me, what's a mid-cap imaging company? Like, I'm not even sure that exists anymore. So you've definitely seen a consolidation where if a company is small and has really promising technology, it's getting acquired before it has a chance to get to that mid-cap stage of, going public and generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. So, and what's been driving that, I think it's been group purchasing by hospitals. They don't want to have to deal with one company for a CT scanner and one company for an MR and one company for nuclear medicine. They just want to do a big group purchasing deal with a single one. Now, how does that extend into AI? I think that we are seeing that in AI. I think that hospitals don't necessarily want to deal with one AI vendor for chest X-ray and another one for brain CT and another one for this and that. And some companies have been successful in offering a pretty wide range of AI, but not all of them. And so I think that there's probably going to be an imperative for a lot of these smaller AI companies to get acquired by a bigger firm, and that's kind of what we're seeing, especially this spring.
Mm-hmm. I had Franz from Deep Sea on a while back, and the approach of having more of a marketplace, and then it's still at least that customer has only one throat to choke if something is going wrong.
I'm glad you said that, not me.
But it gets to that point where it does get very challenging from an operational perspective when you are at the hospital and you have 20 different vendors that you're trying to manage for one specific workflow.
Yeah, for sure.
I think the goal or orientation for a lot of startups is to be acquired. And I think sometimes that doesn't reap the best benefits for innovation and the continuance of new opportunities. That, the multinationals are there for a big reason. And I remember years ago, we heard rumors of other big players like Google or Amazon and Microsoft coming into this space in a more meaningful way in imaging. And we've seen progress. I'm curious, as far as from your perspective, when I'm sure you probably heard similar rumors back in the day of those vendors going in, eyeballing PACS companies and so on. For whatever reason, that never happened. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about why we didn't see it kind of play out the way we have. And we've seen other strategies and approaches that they've taken and their cloud offerings and tools and so on.
Yeah, well, I think that the hyperscalers, the Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they're in imaging in a big way, but just mostly in terms of the cloud storage. Probably I'd have to ask somebody smarter than me why exactly they haven't decided to get in. I mean, the Amazon has done things like, they dip their toe in the health water with Amazon Health and Google and stuff like that. And I think they maybe just concluded that building a business like that is a lot more difficult than just sort of sitting back and partnering with an actual radiology company and having them bring the data stream in terms of the images to store on their cloud service. Because I'm sure that the cloud storage business must be incredibly lucrative for them, just incredibly lucrative. And when you look at like the volume of data that is turning out and the storage requirements and how they're greater and greater and how more and more radiology facilities are turning to cloud storage, I'm sure it's a really good business for them. And maybe they're saying like, well, maybe this is good enough for us. We don't need to do a kind of a direct to consumer model, and consumers being radiologists. Having said that, I know Google at least is poking around with some really interesting AI stuff in terms of algorithms that they've developed that are being used clinically, particularly I think in the UK. So we may still see something come out of that.
I listened to a podcast and it was talking about how during the gold rush, one of the most profitable ways to make money was to be selling supplies to the people that were on their way to the gold rush.
Yeah, those are the guys that
You know,
made the real money. Yeah.
so, you set up your nice cloud services, provide really great tool sets for your vendors to plug into and build dependence on. One of the things that we've seen is there's a lot more democratization when it comes to journalism nowadays. And traditionally, you'd have to, have an actual physical paper. And now you went to blogs, and now everyone has a social media account where they can share their thoughts, and including the companies themselves. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you've seen that grow as far as the um, companies being able to be able to create their own narratives.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that really kind of strikes to the heart of a bigger issue, in journalism in general. I mean, it's no secret that the journalism industry is kind of on the ropes right now. And it's tough for journalists. And I see on LinkedIn some really, really good health journalists who have, lost their jobs or been laid off and can't get new positions. And that's really tough. So that's the downside. I think the upside is with all these channels, there are a lot more opportunities for both journalists and non-journalists to build audiences that they can speak to directly. And I think that we're seeing a lot of people, you're seeing a lot of channels develop. Things like, CT is Us, that Dr. Fishman has put together, Facebook channels, Instagram channels that have kind of sprung up that have really democratized the ability of key opinion leaders to speak directly to people. It's definitely different than what it used to be, where they were, in radiology and in society in general, where there were fewer media outlets that tended to kind of monopolize everything.
In the traditional time period, you would very rarely get to see a sense of the personality of the owner of a company, and now that seems to be a very big, even outside of imaging, there's a degree of importance that's put on creating a full image for, the founder and for the vision of the company. And the company almost builds a character in themselves. And
yeah,
it's interesting to see how the different voices kind of echo differently, depending, I guess, on what the culture that they're trying to put forward.
Yeah, and the rise of video has really changed a lot is accounting for a lot of that. And, we see some people that we work with, some people are really able to use video really well and other people not as well. And it's kind of getting to the point where you're going to have to be able to do video. You're going to have to do things like this broadcast right now, or pre-recorded video, or whatever you want to call it, what you want to do. But you've got to be able to do video in some capacity in order to be able to take full advantage of all these social media channels that we have. And so that's really changed a lot, because when I first started, my background is actually as a media person as opposed to print, and when I got out of school, like all my first jobs were all in print, and I was like, God, well, I went to school and I got these degrees in radio, television. I'm not using any of these skills. And then with the internet coming along, that all changed, and there started doing some more video. And now, a good part of my job of what I do right now is video. So that's, really important. And that, I think that probably changes a lot of the nature of the CEO's job. I think that a lot of CEOs that are executives that are smart see video as something that can improve their ability to reach their employees, reach other people in the industry, and are really kind of leveraging that as a powerful tool.
We have SIIM coming up in about a month and a half, 2 months or so. What are the things that you're eager to take a look at? You'll be, boots on the ground there, walking around, I'm sure, with a microphone in your hand.
Yeah.
So what are you excited about seeing? Who are you looking forward to engaging with and discussing with there?
Yeah, I love SIIM. It's one of my favorite shows. It's a lot smaller than RSNA or HIMSS or ECR, but it's so focused. And I feel like when I go to SIIM, I'm seeing all my old friends. You walk down through the booths, and you just seeing everybody that you know. So I really love that. The collegiality and the camaraderie is really great. One of the storylines that's kind of been developing over this year is reporting. So the reporting segment is really opening up a lot, and we're seeing a lot more attention to reporting. So it's going to be interesting to see what solutions come up from there, and especially AI aided reporting, where AI can go in and really kind of draft a report that radiologists then would review. I'm really interested in foundation models, hearing a lot of really exciting news about how powerful foundation models are being in terms of being able to really quickly develop AI algorithms for specific use cases. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with foundation models. Those are probably like some of the top things on my agenda that I'm going to be looking around at SIIM.
Like you said, SIIM is very unique. I think if you haven't been to SIIM, it's amazing how quaint it is, but it still is a big show feel, but you get to really connect with a lot of the people in a much more meaningful way than you ever would at RSNA.
That's the great thing. At RSNA, it's just like you're running around. You've got every 30 minutes for 4 days, you've got an appointment. And at SIIM, you really get a chance to sit down and talk to people and find out what they're doing and that sort of thing. So it's really cool.
Yeah, I find RSNA, you watch a luminary speak and good luck trying to talk to them afterwards. SIIM, you will get a chance if you want to talk to whoever about whatever topic. So to close out, I'd love to just give you a chance to share how can people get a hold of you? How can people read what you're up to and all of that?
Yeah, so most of my stuff is on the Imaging Wire, the Imaging Wire, and we send out newsletters twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays. So you go over there, pop over there, sign up. We have a YouTube channel, the Imaging Wire YouTube channel. So just do a quick search on that and you'll find all the videos that we do. We have lots of great videos on interviews with key opinion leaders in radiology, CEOs, radiologists, and that sort of thing. We've been doing lots of webinars lately. So those are really a great opportunity to kind of, present questions to people live. And then we've got social channels, Instagram and LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff. So, we do a fair bit of stuff on LinkedIn. If you're not following us on LinkedIn, make sure you pop over there and type in the Imaging Wire and follow us on LinkedIn.
I'll make sure to include the links in the notes for this episode.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Pittsburgh.
All right. See you then.
Yeah, the magic of the SIIM. Interoperability, the dream machine. DICOM, HL7, IHE, and Snap. We're building the future, never looking back.